more tool that is popularly known, and the second word, chandlery, seems to be even more of a puzzle for people. Though that's the first question that I frequently get asked when visitors come into the shop is, what is a chandlery? What is a marlinspike? And I do my best to keep my patience answering that question over and over again, but it does help. Have to remind myself that it provides a way to explain what it is that I do to people. And simply put, a chandlery is just a sort of a antiquated word for a store. It does refer to a store with a maritime connotation, but it really is just sort of a repository for nautical goods, although it has its origins as the candlery, the candle maker. And I believe that it was probably as a result of an enterprising whale oil merchant, when whale oil was the material that lit the world, and was an important depot for the candle making industry, that an enterprising chandler or candler decided to start stocking the other goods and materials that the whale ships would need, and that included rope as well as all kinds of other goods and materials, from food and hardware and lumber. So the chandlery sort of became a general store of sorts in seaport towns. The marlinspike is a tool that was used by sailmakers and riggers. This is a large version of a marlinspike. It's basically just a conical tapered tool. The name of the tool, Marlinspike, refers to, I think, the root words of it, I think, are based on the Latin mar or mare, mare, meaning sea, lin, pertaining to linen or line. So it was the tool, the tool for working with the sea twine, the type of hemp twine that was used commonly for a variety of rigging purposes, from lashing pulleys and blocks together to constructing the standing rigging altogether. And so it was a tool used more for prying and splicing. Nowadays they're used more as marlinspikes are still used. They're more commonly used working with cable and wire these days, as there's just less rope around in the maritime trades, but it's a tool that is still used today. However, it's actually not a tool that I use very frequently in my own work. It's just the scale of it just isn't something that is particularly useful for me. I generally work with just my hands or a few other smaller scale tools, but the name of the tool is what led to the identification of the craft, which largely developed during the advent of larger and more complex sailing vessels that began to travel the world roughly from the 15th century on up through the 19th century. And when those larger sailing vessels were built and constructed, there was a whole craft and technology that was invented or adapted that enabled the sails and the rigs to be constructed. The sailmakers and the sailmakers and bosun's mates were the ones that were most practiced in those trades, and I don't know what the particular offices might have been called in the early days, but you know, as the craft progressed into the certainly into the Navy and the merchant marine realm, you know, there was the rank of bosun mate, and so the bosun mate became the one most skilled working with the rope and rigging. But this whole art form developed from adapting the skills that went into producing and building the rigging, and it was extended to embellishing their own personal gear in many ways, and it was really that sort of fancy extension of the practical means of rigging that led the craft of Marlinspike seamanship towards more of an art form rather than just a practical rigging trade. What gave the look of that craft sort of a distinctive character was more the tool, the material and the application rather than some of the individual technique. Much of the technique was developed and borrowed from cultures from around the world, and you can see that in some of the names applied to some of the techniques that were used. You know, names such as Portuguese sinnet, which is a type of braid, or French braid, or Spanish hitching. It's an illustration that, you know, as the sailors were traveling around the world, encountering other cultures, that those names were just adapted from other cultures and not necessarily being invented by the sailmakers or the riggers or fishermen. They were adapting and borrowing other forms of textile technology, weaving, braiding, and so on. It's interesting to think, you know, what the precursor to some of that technology was in various forms of, you know, was it various textile crafts? Was it clothing? Was it rug braiding? And how far back did that go? I've done a little bit of looking into the history of some of the early, to try and find some of the earliest names for some of the techniques that I use, and haven't gotten very far. It seems that there isn't a lot of early text beyond going back earlier than maybe the 1800s, or one of the earliest. It's a reprint of an early text that I have published in 1808 called the Young Sea Officer's Sheet Anchor, which details some of the rigging practices that were used on British sailing vessels. But prior to that, I haven't been able to find anything in print describing knot tying or rope and rigging practices. I tend to think it might be part of a function of, you know, those earlier than that, the people that were practiced and working in those trades were probably too busy doing the work and didn't really have the time to create a manual or a text. And I think that might be common across the arts or trades. Is, you know, at what point did people start to think that it would be important to not just write down histories or histories of cultures, but history of how to make things. So what I think of as Marlinspike work, this is a bell rope. It's one of the standard pieces that I was, or original types of constructions that I was initially drawn to. This is actually one of the very first ones that I made about 25 years ago now, I guess. And I think of pieces like this and the fancy Marlinspike work as being more of a combination of weaving and braiding type of work rather than knot tying. I mean, there are some knots in the work, but I tend to think of it as a much more applied form of three-dimensional weaving and braiding rather than just sort of like basic knot tying. So the bell rope, as I said, the bell rope was just a piece of a lanyard that would attach to the clapper of a bell as a handhold for facilitating ringing the bell. One of the typical forms that standard forms that I was drawn to. One of the other configurations that was very similar in some ways in terms of the technique is the handle. This is a small version of a sea chest that I had made. The sea chest was the sailor's main piece of luggage, more specifically on the whaling vessels, not so much on Navy or military vessels, where on a whaling voyage, the sailors would have be on a 2 or 3 year stint, and they sometimes had the luxury of having space to put a sea chest if they had one. Whereas on the Navy type ships, the enlisted sailors would struggle to find a place to sling a hammock if they were lucky. The ship spaces were filled with ordnance and other sorts of military kind of gear. But the way that I learned was largely just through books. One of the first books that I had to learn from was the Harrison Book of Knots. This is the kind of detail that I was working from, and it was the reason why I found myself in this endeavor. It's a little hard for me to pinpoint the exact reasons, but it began as a hobby that I was re-inspired to pick up as I was finishing graduate school, and I was rereading Moby Dick, and I was reading some other maritime adventure stories, and I thought, well, maybe I'd like to build myself a sea chest. And I had received a copy of this book much earlier on when I was an early teen, but some of the description was beyond my comprehension level at the time. Anyway, several years later, and I rediscovered the book on my shelves, picked it up, and found that a lot of the descriptions that were difficult for me earlier on all of a sudden made sense. And before I knew it, I was proficient. And as I said, this bell rope here was one of the first pieces that I created, working off of the description in the Harrison book here. And before I knew it, I was developing inventory and wondering what to do with it. So I created a website and found that there was a response, and people were interested in the craft and interested in buying the pieces, and one thing led to another. After relocating to Deer Isle about 15 years ago, found the space for rent here in Stonington, and really began to opened a whole new market for me in certain ways, because although I had initially associated the work with being purely maritime and my market being a maritime related crowd, the location here in Stonington has been really terrific for me. It's a very diverse sort of clientele that comes through the town, that visits the area. I have people who are world-renowned artists of all sorts, and it really made me begin to think about my work as more of an art form rather than just a maritime craft. So I try to distinguish it, more as I began to think of it more as a sculptural fiber art rather than just as I said, maritime and related craft kind of endeavor. As I mentioned, some of the tools that I use, these are some of the most common tools that I use in my kit. Just a pair of needle nose pliers. If I'm not just manipulating the cord in my fingers alone, I use a variety of needles. This happens to be a curved needle, which is useful for being able to hook the point through a opening between strands of twine. But I have a variety of different needle sizes depending on the size of cord that I'm working with. And the other tool is a fid. It's sort of the wooden variation of the Marlinspike. You don't use a fid for prying and levering jobs that the heavier Marlinspike would be used for. The fid is just more of a stretching or tool to open up, enlarge a hole, whether it be a grommet or a hole in leather. It's more of a splicer, a tool that just helps, helps in the weaving process, I should say. Most of the materials that I work with are natural fibers. Cotton, hemp, and Manila are and linen are the primary materials. One of the interesting pieces of history pertaining to the difference between hemp and Manila is that these days the distinction is often not understood between what hemp fiber is versus Manila fiber, and in often cases it's marketed or sold as Manila hemp. But the reason for that is in the early days of rigging for the whale ships and the Navy ships, and prior to the 1800s, say, most of the rigging line was made from hemp fiber, which grew in various parts of Europe. Some of it was imported to rope making facilities, rope walks as they're known, from Russia or Italy. So it would be referred to as the Russian hemp or the Italian hemp. But then some point, in the mid 1800s, say that trade with the Philippines became more economically feasible, and a plant that grew there was known as abaca, was discovered by Western civilization, and they saw that it was a useful plant for making, you could extract fibers from it and make a high quality rope. And so the plant fiber began to be exported from the Philippines to rope walks in the East Coast. And so, as I said, whereas the hemp was referred to as the Russian hemp or the Italian hemp, all natural fiber rope was referred to as hemp in those days. And so when the abaca fiber came in from Manila, it was just referred to as the Manila hemp, even though it's a totally different plant. The advantage to Manila was that it didn't require being tarred. Hemp was a stronger fiber, but it needed to be weatherproofed through the use of pine tar and regular application of pine tar, which was a dirty, pine tar itself isn't dirty, but it made the rigging stiff if it got cold. It was sticky, it required cure time, and it just was added significantly to the amount of labor that went into maintaining the rigging of hemp rigged sailing vessels. Manila, by contrast, did not require a tar treatment. As with many sort of tropical hardwoods, you tend to think of those as being much more rot resistant, and the same concept applied to the Manila fiber, is that it was much more rot resistant in its natural state. So a huge labor savings. It wasn't quite as strong as the hemp rope, but because of the economics of the labor savings, it began to very rapidly displace the hemp from rigs. But the name Manila hemp persisted, and so the distinction between, as I said, hemp and Manila rope has been largely lost. These days, the only way to get hemp rope is to have it imported from rope makers in Europe, but it is a nice material to work with. The fibers are very soft and fuzzy in comparison to Manila, which you can get splinters from without too much trouble working with bare hands. So as I mentioned, the bell ropes are one thing. The beckets, the handles on the sea chest, were another of the traditional forms that I was drawn to. I think of the bell ropes and beckets as being, here's another one, sort of combinations of geometric patterns, and I think that geometry is what sort of drew me to this type of work. Not the application so much, not the material, although the spiral nature of the rope itself certainly is a contributing factor into the geometry. I have some as a comparison to the other sea chest. Here's another example of a becket. They're called beckets because they were a becket is another term for the part of something that you hold on to. spars of the tall ships had ropes hanging below them that sailors could stand on, and those were called foot ropes. But across the top of the spar, there were loops of cord strung that you could hook your arm through. And those loops of cord were called beckets. And so the name just translated from the rigging down to the sea chest. And so the part of the sea chest that you grab onto is therefore the becket. So they're referred to commonly as the sea chest becket. This is another particularly large, more sculptural version of a sea chest becket, with a double handle, which was not unheard of. Sometimes the inner handle was more of a utility, more of like a cargo lift kind of purchase point, and then the outer was the more decorative part of the becket. But in this one here, I made them both decorative.
And Tim, you mentioned that there was no early records or guidebooks. The first one that you found was a copy from 1808. So the seamen in those early days, they were learning by doing, and very busy doing that. And you learned, you had the books, but you were self-taught. And I'm curious to know, how long did it take you to complete that first piece, that first bell rope?
Well, I don't have a crystal clear memory of that, but I do feel that it started to come to me very quickly, probably within the course of a summer, I would say. I can remember sitting on our porch overlooking the river in the town of Potsdam, which is where I was going to school and met my wife. But just I'm trying to find the page here. There was one particular construction that it's, I don't know how to, and I can remember as an early teen that this method of building that knob, which finishes, this whole thing starts out like this, but finishes down to a knob, something like that. And that was the sort of keystone piece that served as an epiphany for me in terms of how to dissect the diagram. And I remember being stuck on that when I was an early teen, and kind of like I could only go so far, but just opening the book and seeing that illustration, it was apparent to me. And one of my best skill has always been that I've been able to look at something and kind of have this ability to make my hands create the thing. And I'm a good book learner. I wouldn't have done well in the traditional sailor's way of learning by watching somebody do it. I don't think I would have gotten very far, but seeing the picture, seeing the illustration, I could really dissect it and visualize it. In my primary method of teaching, and teaching myself, and what has led to the distinguishing feature of my work, I think, is the transitions from one technique to the next. Like each of these sections is a different technique made up of either, sometimes a single strand. This section in here is one single strand forming the whole sort of basket weave pattern. This section here is, you can kind of see that there's a spiral character to this. Each of those spiral rows, like a corn row, represents a strand. And this section is an example of a type of work where you have identifiable warp and weft strands in the same way, to use the same terminology that you might have in weaving a tapestry, or weaving a textile, having a warp and weft strands. But to get back to what I was saying about how I taught myself, or how I conceptualized pieces like this, was I was able to visualize how to start and stop, how to physically attach these multiple strands to the piece, and then get it into my hands to do the work. I was putting myself to sleep at night, lying in bed. It only worked lying on my back, sort of head oriented toward the ceiling. And I would go into this sort of meditative mode of just visualizing how to, after having looked at it in the book, which gave me an idea of how the work was mechanically done, but then lying in bed and just visualizing how am I actually going to put that together? How am I going to make it work? And so I was using that method. I was able to make something like this with very little trial and error. There were some other smaller pieces that came about ahead of time, but in terms of a bell rope of scale, as I said, this was the first one that one of the first. I think of it as the first one that I'd made. My work has, one of the aspects of bell ropes that I was drawn to was the just like I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. But as I was saying, the transition of the various techniques is what I identify as sort of one of the most important features, creating sort of an overall aesthetic from the top to bottom. I think in the introduction, you were perhaps a little overstating my qualifications as one of the few experts in Marlinspike work. There are like anything, there's a community, there's a large number of people around the world that practice Marlinspike work, and there's actually a group that was founded in the UK called the International Guild of Knot Tiers, and they promote the education and work of this nature, but I still feel that for whatever reason, I've been able to maintain a sort of a traditional aesthetic that I don't see in a lot of work that's produced by others around the world, frankly. I feel like, and that was making these transitions, creating the overall, having an overall sensibility to the overall shape of the piece. It doesn't have to have a whole lot of fancy bright colors mixed in. It can be just very sort of a subtle variation in shape, from the smaller diameter up around the eye here in this set of beckets, increasing in diameter down at the bottom, which in the sake of a handle, you want the larger diameter to, spread the load across your hand, so it's not as cutting on your hand when you're picking up a heavy chest. That was the reason for having a sort of that teardrop, or not just the teardrop shape, but the variation in diameter. But I've been able to retain that aesthetic and create this sort of aesthetic in ways that, as I said, is what sets my work apart and distinguishes my work. And that was also the reason that the Maine Arts Commission, the Belvedere Craft Award was given. I was very pleased to hear that was what they picked up on as well. I didn't know anything about the selection process until afterwards, but sort of like the exit interview, they pointed that out to me. So I was very pleased and satisfied to hear that. And so the same thing goes for, this is the handle of a ditty bag. I'll show you the ditty bag in complete view in a second, but here we have just a section of cable laid rope, which is to say that I've taken 3 strands of cord and relayed it into a larger diameter rope, and have created these sort of knobs at the top and bottom, setting off the braid in the section, and it's all continuous right down to where it joins into the top of the ditty bag. The ditty bag being another one of the sailors' pieces of luggage. It was something that you could just sling over your shoulder and put your sundry items in, when you're have the opportunity to go into a port, or as a sailmaker might use it to stow all of his tools and bits of twine and things like that. So so where my work has progressed over the years is, I continue to make the bell ropes in various forms. Here's another version. This happens to be a piece of synthetic material, which I make use of in limited application, but if somebody wants a bell rope that is going to be, subject to much more a harsher use, say that, where it's going to be pulled on and yanked on, and this is a polyester material that very weather resistant. It's going to withstand a lot more abuse than something of this nature, which is a more decorative sculptural piece.
No, a piece like that with the natural materials, it looks very dense. Are they very heavy and solid?
Well, this one doesn't have any finish applied. It retains its flexibility. This one has a varnish, which these days I would not varnish a piece, because it behaves in an outdoor environment, especially, it behaves just like wood. You do all the varnishing that and surface treatment that you can, but moisture is still going to get in somehow. And I've seen it where varnished bell ropes like this begin to discolor and rot from the inside out, and so varnish isn't something that I recommend or use these days. What I do, one of the finishes that I like to use, and going back to this set of beckets here, this was plain white cotton, and they are quite stiff, and they don't deform easily, but they're finished with just basic wood stain. So the stain really penetrates and would provide a a degree of weatherproofness that I feel would be superior to just varnish, and it also provides a color. It wouldn't, sometimes with the handles like a sea chest becket, I do have a set here, just plain white. Sometimes customers like a plain white becket, but comes with a caveat that if you're going to be handling it, it's going to get dirty. But so sometimes I recommend a stain just for durability, but obvious, for the obvious reason of preempting any discoloration that would come from handling.
And you had mentioned tar earlier. What was that used for? What was the purpose of using the tar?
Pine tar was used as a weatherproofing material. So hemp rope rigging that was in the weather constantly needed to be painted with, there were several steps. There was actually, the bare rope would be covered with, first it would have a smaller diameter rope laid into the groove to kind of fill the voids between the rope. Then it would be wrapped with strips of canvas, like you would wrap bicycle handlebars, say. And then over the top of that, there would be a tight spiral wrap put on over the whole thing. And each stage of those, the filling the spiral, the canvas strip, and the final spiral wrap like this called serving were all done with material that was impregnated with pine tar, all as an effort to keep water away from the core rope where the real tensile strength comes from. So the tar was used as I said, just as a means of displacing water, making it waterproof. Pine tar, there's still a industry for pine tar. Sometimes it's referred to as Stockholm tar because so much of it came from Stockholm, Sweden, and it's a material that's still used throughout Europe and Scandinavia as a weatherproofing material on some of the old wood shingled roofs that they use there. It's also the same material that you would use on traditional wood cross-country skis. So it's available. And I made use of it on some of my pieces. This large set of beckets here, these were finished with pine tar, and I liked the traditional, or maintaining sort of the traditional aesthetic or traditional feel of sticking with the traditional material of pine tar, but these are several years old now, so the tar has had a chance to cure, and it's not sticky to the touch anymore. There's a good amount of it has soaked in, so depending on the mass that you were applying the tar to, you have different degrees of absorption, and so this portion is leather, but just because of the diameter here, the amount of material with just a brushed on application, a lot of the tar soaks in, so the result is this lighter shade of grayish brown versus some of these other sections where applying sort of the equal amount of tar, it doesn't have as much material to absorb, and so the color state retains it results in a darker shade. But some people like the smell of pine tar, but these beckets still have a very strong smoky odor. And when I used pine tar more regularly in the shop here, that was the first thing that people picked up on, was and it was sometimes overpowering. So I've kind of gotten away from using pine tar just because I don't want to be subjected myself to smelling it and being saturated by it all the time. And it was and as maintaining sort of a user-friendly retail space, it would tend to get a little it would be overpowering for some people, so where they couldn't tolerate the smell. And you never know. Some people come in, they walk in the door, and the first thing they do is inhale just as much of the pine tar odor as they can. But those are the salty seamen that
And Chris has a question. He says he's curious if your work is mostly as artworks, or do you create functional objects for sailboats?
Well, I occasionally have a commission. I'm taking fewer and fewer commissions these days, but if somebody approaches me with wanting to have a helm or a wheel covered, I can sometimes fit that into my work routine. I'm finding my market transitioning away from the maritime application just because of the recognition that I'm receiving as my work as more artistic. And so whereas I'm happy to I continue to make the bell ropes, I continue to make the traditional forms of this type of thing, whether somebody wants to use it on a boat or a door, either is fine with me. But in a sense, I'm kind of been following where the market leads me. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I find that I'm trying to develop new ways of presenting the craft in pieces that tend to be more sculptural in nature. And so, as I said, whereas I said that I will always continue to make sea chest beckets and bell ropes, those are my core pieces, and the ditty bags. I've gotten a lot of pleasure out of making things like wrapped stones as paperweights, and they are, to me, kind of the contrast to the complexity of the bell rope being like a sampler of technique. I think of pieces like this as distilling the complexity down to a single element on an otherwise blank canvas, but with a certain geometry, with a certain overall geometry aesthetic to it. So whether it's a wrapped stone like this, or some of the other, I've developed some jewelry pieces, which I never thought of myself as making jewelry, but these have been one of my most popular items over the past 8 or 10 years that I've had the shop here. And it was something that I only would have developed after working in my shop space here. I never would have developed this if I was just sitting at home making bell ropes probably, but having the inspiration of just being in the space where I'm at has led to pieces like this, which this is a pendant, just a beach stone pendant kind of thing. Did I answer your question, Chris?
Yes, he's on there. Yeah. I would like to ask, what is the largest piece that you've made?
Well, probably the largest piece would be in the category of a banister, and there have been a few different examples of those that I've done, but there is, I was going through some old photos, and there is a bell rope that I created where it was 5 feet long. It wasn't 5 feet of this, but there were, it was, I think, perhaps more on this category where, I'd used, made use of the bare rope as part of the design element, and then, ornamented ornamented various sections of the base rope.
And that must have been heavy.
Well, I don't think of the pieces as being particularly heavy. This is, like I said, this piece is about 20 inches long, I guess, and it's only a couple of pounds. But so I've made some good sized bell ropes. There are some large, lengthy banisters that I've created. Some of them were that the banisters aren't necessarily, ornamented the full length, but just by virtue of having X number of feet of material that you have to work with and measure out and get the proper dimension, and then finish with a fancy terminal. That's the complicating factor of doing something large, where you have a sort of a length constraint, but then this doing something like this at the end of that is sometimes not an exact science.
All right, I think it's a good time to open up for questions if anyone has any questions for Tim. Any questions?
On the opposite end of how large, I mean, I've tended to gravitate towards small.
Oh yeah, that's so cute. And how long would it take you to do a piece like that with your skill where it is today?
This would probably take a couple of days.
That's
Because of
fascinating.
the scale, the scale being so miniature.
Yeah.
I mean, you can see it's the same sort of, has some of the same elements as this larger one, but really down to the size of working with thread.
Right. And we have a question from DJ. She'd like to know, how do you keep tension on a piece as you work the rope?
Well, there's really only one of the techniques that I regularly employ is called Spanish hitching, and it's this woven element. It's the woven element that I was describing earlier with the warp and weft strands. And I can refer back to this picture in the book. So this is the picture, the sort of the blown up view of Spanish hitching, where you have what I think of as the warp being the strand that spirals around the body, and then the series of vertical weft strands that get looped around the warp in sequence. And so the part that you really have to keep tension on is the warp. Something like that, I just have developed my own technique for holding it in my hand and sort of bracing it against my thigh as I do the work. That was one of the hardest parts of learning, the Spanish hitching, for example, was how to hold your hands. And I just developed my own method for that. There are, I suppose, I haven't even looked, but I suppose there are probably YouTube videos now of somebody showing you how to do Spanish hitching. And I've seen, I know there are. I've seen a couple, and they aren't what I do. But they didn't seem better to me than what I was doing, and that my own technique. So that and doing the Spanish hitching over a large section like this, I'm holding tension on that warp strand with my left, and then manipulating the weft strands with my right hand. And I keep the tension sort of braced on, one or more of my fingers, and that's something that I have to take a break and, let the blood flow back into my fingers at times. That gets that's hard on my hands, but a lot of the other sections, this is done with a needle. Each little hitch is cinched up, and there isn't anything extra to hold tension with. Things like the knobs here, they're constructed and tightened. This is, it has the look of a monkey's fist knot, if you're familiar with that at all, but this is actually a knob that is constructed in 5 strands. You can kind of see that it has 5 parts on the face, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And for tightening, working the slack out of this, this is where I use my pliers, to be able to get in between. This one's tight, so there's no getting my pliers in here, but this is that's where the fine tip needle nose pliers come in.
All right, so we're just about out of time, but I'd like to point folks to Tim's website. He has a website. It's at www.marlinspike.com, and that's Marlinspike with an E. I put it in the chat. And he's also on Instagram with some wonderful pictures of his work and many other beautiful things. He's a great photographer. Highly recommend you check him out on Instagram. I believe it's Marlinspike Chandlery on there.
If I can interrupt, my website I initially set it up as a business portal, with a shopping cart, but I have found myself being overwhelmed with internet orders, and so I've taken away the online shopping feature from my website so that I can just sort of focus more on building inventory for the shop here. I don't have regular hours this time of year, but during, starting around Memorial Day, that's when I start keeping regular shop hours. Any other time of year, I'm open by appointment and always willing to meet people here in Stonington if you contact me ahead of time. One of the things that I have put together is a bell rope kit with some of my own instructions for making, this style of bell rope. And whereas I don't maintain shopping on my website, you'll see a link to my Etsy shop. And so when I have finished pieces available and I have the time, I put items for sale through Etsy, and I'll make sure that the bell rope kit is available there if anybody was interested in that.
Yeah, that's great. So thank you so much for sharing your wonderful shop and your craft with us. It's really mind-blowing that such a craft it's obviously existed for many, many years, and now it's something that is not practiced as much. So it's great that there are folks like you who are keeping that skill alive, and we're just very happy to have you here with us this evening. So thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you.
And I'd just like to point out to folks, for the Historical Society, we are getting ready to send out our annual newsletter. Please go onto the website, sign up for our email updates, and we're also looking for folks to renew memberships or join. It's not expensive at all. $15 for an individual, $20 for a family, $100 for a lifetime membership, and we're always accepting donations to keep our programs going. And if you have any high school students that need to do community service, send them our way. We can find something for them to do. And get in touch. We're here, and we will be, next month, we will be having our next history hour with Dr. Joshua Smith. So we're looking forward to that. And thank you again, Tim, for joining us this evening. It's an honor to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So good evening, everyone, and good night. Take care.